Hi everyone, I wanted to spend some time talking about the Psalms of the Old Testament in particular because of their vital role in the life of the church. And I would have to say, out of all of the Old Testament, if I had to say what is the most important element of the Old Testament for people to become more familiar with, particularly as the church lives out its life in worship, the Psalms would definitely be the most important, and I'll try to explain in this lecture why that is the case. So, in the other lecture, we were talking about the Old Testament being an important part of early Christian worship, and of the Old Testament, there was a special emphasis placed on the use of Psalms. The Psalms are quoted more often in the New Testament than any other Old Testament book. So, this leads us to believe that people like Jesus, his disciples, Paul, and so forth, were very familiar, maybe intimately familiar, with the text of the Psalms itself. Maybe they had them memorized, it's certainly possible. We know that the Psalms were part of the worship in the temple in Jerusalem at the time of Jesus, so that's fairly well attested. Also, these Psalms have been continuously part of a monastic prayer practice in the Christian church, so we'll talk a little bit more about that. But the Psalms themselves are very important to monastic prayer. And if you'll look at your copy of the Book of Common Prayer, you'll notice that the Psalter, which is the collection of Psalms, the Book of Psalms, is reproduced in the Book of Common Prayer. Now, you probably have never thought too much about that fact, just assumed it's there, and but think about what that says about the role of Psalms in the life of prayer. So, Psalms are part of and understood as and are supposed to be part of the prayer of the church, and I would even argue part of our personal prayer practice. So there's a reason they are reproduced in the Book of Common Prayer and not just simply referred to. So it's definitely the longest text, both Old and New Testament, longest biblical text that's reproduced in the Book of Common Prayer. So, thinking more about the use of Psalms in worship, the Psalms were definitely included in the prayer practices of the Dead Sea Scroll community, so we have evidence of that. So, this was a Jewish community living outside of Jerusalem in the desert around the time of Jesus. So, we know that they prayed the Psalms in this community. It was also described as a part of morning and evening prayer in 4th century Jerusalem. So if you listen to the other lecture, you'll know that we have access to lectionaries from 4th century Jerusalem. So we know that the Psalms were incorporated as part of morning and evening prayer there. And eventually, recitation of certain psalms became associated with certain times of day. So, Psalm 62 and 148 to 150, which are known as the Lauds, are associated with the morning, and Psalm 140 becomes associated with evening prayer. Now, these association of psalms with particular times of day perhaps dates back to Jewish synagogue practices, although we know really very little about practices at that time, but it's certainly possible that these were already part of Jewish practices that were just subsumed by later Christian communities. Eventually, Christians developed a common weekly cycle of Psalms. So, what I mean by that is that over the course of a week, different communities, monastic communities, or in Jerusalem, the community of clergy there would pray the Psalms, recite the Psalms all 150 of them over a weekly cycle. And we know from evidence in the Jerusalem Christian community that lay people sometimes participated in that activity, although it doesn't seem that they were required to do so, but there were particularly pious lay people that also participated in praying the Psalms through every week. Eventually, the Psalms became really the primary spiritual practice of monastic communities. So, imagine this, monks were required to memorize the Psalms in their first year. So, if you decide you want to become a monk, you go to the monastery, and the first thing you need to do is to memorize all 150 Psalms, and typically you have 1 year to do that. And I think most monks were probably successful. Now, in our day, we cannot imagine having to memorize that much material. There's an interesting book by Mary Carruthers called The Book of Memory. So if you ever want to refer to it, it's a fascinating book. And she talks about medieval practices of memory and what people were able to do by memory in that time. In our day, we rely on all sorts of things to help get us through our day where we don't have to memorize things anymore. So I used to know lots and lots of phone numbers, and I barely know my own phone number now because all I do is push a button. I don't have to know the number. But people that didn't have books had to memorize lots of things to keep them handy. So Mary Carruthers talks about the fact that in the medieval period, um, you could go to a monk and say, tell me the eighth verse of every psalm beginning with number 100 through 150, just as an example. And the monk could tell you what the eighth verse of every psalm is. Or they knew psalms backwards. So if you would say recite the 99th psalm beginning with the last verse and going backwards to the first verse, they could do that for you. So people had absolutely incredible memories. And of course, they had to work on it, and they didn't have a lot of other things to do. But still, it's hard for us to get our heads around the fact that people memorized things to an extent that we cannot even fathom in our own day. So again, that book is called The Book of Memory, if you're ever interested in reading more about that topic. It's really fascinating. So monastic prayer, when we think of the bulk of prayer, it was nearly synonymous with praying the Psalms or reciting the Psalms. So most of monastic prayer is psalm recitation. So those two things are near equivalents. Interestingly, memorizing the Psalter was also a method for learning Latin. So we have a number of Psalters, or again, a Psalter is just a book with all of the Psalms um, listed in it. And we have a number of English manuscripts, for example, where beneath the Latin words they've written the English equivalent. And this isn't sort of done occasionally, this is done very methodically, although by hand. And so this was a way for monks to learn Latin because they knew these Latin expressions uh, verbatim, but they also could relate them back to the way the Psalms would be prayed in English. So most likely, most monks would know how to pray the Psalms in both Latin and English, of course, if you spoke English, um, which is, again, kind of an amazing process. So, why the Psalms of all the Old Testament books? So, why did the Psalms take on this vital role in Christian prayer? I think, for one thing, the poetry in the Psalms is very evocative with imagery and metaphor. So, we talked a bit about poetry last time and how its meaning can be wide ranging and it really makes us think and it helps us contemplate God. So I think poetry spoke to the hearts of people. Uh, Although it's more difficult literature, it spoke to the hearts of people much more closely than did the narrative of the Old Testament. So people didn't pray, I don't know, the stories in Genesis, but they prayed the Psalms, which is interesting. Also, the language in the Psalms is highly personal. So, what I mean by that is if you just read through some Psalms, you'll notice that the pronouns I, me, possessive my are used much, much, much more in the Psalms than in any other book, along with you and your. So those words, both on the mouth of the psalmist and on the mouth of God in the Psalms. So it's much more like if you're familiar with the Jewish theologian Martin Buber, he talks about I and thou, or that sort of very personal relationship with God. And this personal relationship is expressed much more clearly in the Psalms, I would argue, than in any other book of the Bible. So I think this is another reason people have latched onto the Psalms as a spiritual discipline or a way of praying. Also, the Psalms encompass a broad range of human emotions. As a matter of fact, St. Athanasius supposedly said that the Psalter is like a garden that contains all sorts of plants. So we can think of different plants, some which are very beautiful and that we gravitate towards, and some that are, I don't know, maybe prickly cactuses or plants that are even a bit ugly. But the Psalter is like a garden that has all sorts of things in it. So the Psalms contain praise and wonderment, sorrow and lament, guilt, shame, and contrition, intense pain and fear, even rage and the desire for vengeance. So there's some very um, unsavory parts of the Psalms that express this rage and vengeance towards enemies in particular. Also, joy and pleasure. And finally, sets of moral and practical instructions, somewhat similar to what we talked about last week. So sometimes people say that it's difficult to relate to the psalm because we like the sort of praise and wonderment ones, or the very happy and joyous ones, but maybe those that express rage and desire for vengeance we shy away from, or the ones that express pain and fear. Um, and I think that's okay to a certain extent. However, even if you're not feeling intense pain and fear, it's a good idea to remember the times in your life when you have experienced pain and fear, or maybe you are ministering to someone pastorally who is experiencing pain and fear, and thus reciting the psalm can help you relate to those feelings that they're experiencing. Or certainly, if you don't know anybody, you can imagine people who are experiencing pain and fear in this world. So, the Psalter covers really the entire range of human emotions. And um, N.T. Wright wrote a book on the Psalms, and he said that even though we like to pick and choose our psalms, they come as a package. And that's sort of just like life in a way, that life isn't always joy and pleasure. There's plenty of sorrow and lament. Uh, there's mourning and there's dancing. And just like the rest of the Old Testament, the Psalter records the good and the good and the bad of life. So it's all there. The Psalms also teach us to live in God's time, and what I mean by that is there's many Psalms that talk about life sort of in perspective. Expressions like a day is like a day, 1,000 years is like a day uh, in the eyes of God. So thinking about the long term, thinking about time through God's eyes instead of our own stressed time. The Psalms also invite us to live in God's sacred space. So, for the ancient Israelites, this is often referred to as Zion or Jerusalem. So, Zion is just basically the holy mountain in the city of Jerusalem, and was where the temple was located. For Christians, this has, at least historically, been understood more metaphorically. So, the call to the Israelite to travel up to Zion has been read as an invitation for us to live in God's sacred space, or perhaps an invitation for God, since we understand our bodies to be temples of the Holy Spirit, an invitation for us to allow God to live in our own sacred space. But thinking about approaching that space, or recognizing the presence of God in the world, I think is an important theme of the Psalms. Finally, there is much in the Psalms that teach us to live as part of God's wonderful creation. So we get common expressions like the heavens declare the glories of God, um, that God is revealed in nature, that one of the Psalms talks about the trees clapping their hands for joy. So, thinking about us as humans being part of creation and the entire creation in God's world, and understanding our place in that, I think is another theme that the Psalms often address. Finally, I wanted to talk a bit about Psalms in the life of the laity. So I've spent some time mentioning that Psalms were very important in the monasteries, but it wasn't only there. So some of the earliest texts in the vernacular, meaning the common spoken language of the people, are psalm texts. So we tend to think of maybe the psalm vernacular text as beginning in the Renaissance, but we actually have, um, just to pull one example, the oldest example of what is called Old Irish, or the oldest form of the Irish language, is part of a 6th century Psalter. So this is long before the Renaissance. So people were copying down psalms, not in Latin, but in the language of the people, at least going back that far. I don't know if any of you know the story of St. Columba, who ended up in the island of Iona, if anybody's ever been there, but was exiled from Ireland over a dispute about it, making a copy of a Psalter, um, which to us seems like a ridiculous reason to be kicked out of the monastery, but there was some dispute about who owned this particular Psalter, which just means that people were very interested in the Psalms and were interested in having their own copy for their own use. And this goes back, to the early Middle Ages. And referring back to the Mary Carruthers book again, she notes that many lay people had at least some Psalms memorized. Some lay people had all of the Psalms memorized. So again, this wasn't just an activity restricted to the monastery, restricted to morning and evening prayer in the monastery, but lay people were also interested in incorporating the Psalms in their own prayer life. And people were exposed to the psalm recitation in cathedrals. So, for example, if you go to Canterbury Cathedral today and listen to evensong, you can hear the community, these aren't monks anymore, but the choir chant the Psalms in the evening. And this would be something similar to what people maybe, if they couldn't sit in the choir, they could at least hear in the cathedral, um, could hear monks chanting the psalm and would become exposed to the psalms in that way, and in a sense have the opportunity to join in the monastic prayer that was going on in the cathedral. So even if people couldn't read, there were many, many ways for lay people to become more familiar with the Psalms as prayer. So, Psalms in Christian prayer are indisputably the reciting the Psalms are the most common spiritual practice for Christians of the last 2 millennia. So, I think that is really a significant thing to consider in that many, many people have found spiritual comfort and spiritual growth in praying the Psalms. And again, this book by N.T. Wright that I referred to on the Psalms, I can't recall the name of it right off the top of my head, but just go on Amazon and type N.T. Wright and Psalms, and I'm sure it will come right up. He talks about the fact that even though this practice is difficult beginning, that if you can stick with it, it really is a transformative practice. And because of the witness of so many people that have found this practice to be helpful, it's something I think that we all should seriously consider in our own prayer life. I mentioned earlier that the Psalms operate as a complete set, so they are honest accounts of the highs and lows of the human experience. So, again, some of them we really like, and others are somewhat disturbing, but that's part of life. They are very honest expressions of human emotions and of the human experience. Also, I might note that there are many plans available for reading the Psalms. So if you go to your Book of Common Prayer and open to the first Psalm, it will say, I forget the exact wording, but on the first Psalm it will say day one, for example, and just a small caption under the title. And if you want to read the Psalms over the course of a month, you read all of the Psalms in order for day one, and by the end of the 30 days, you will be done reading all of the Psalms. So this particular practice was set up by Thomas Cranmer when he compiled the first prayer book in I'm not very good on dates, but I think 1549, so they're mid 16th century. So this particular plan for reading the Psalms has been around a long time, but you can go on the internet and there are any number of different plans and ideas for reading the Psalms through in a cycle. So if you've never tried this particular spiritual practice, I would encourage at least at some point in your life, maybe in the upcoming Advent or Lenten season, to think about reading through the Psalms. And I think, if nothing else, even trying it once will be a wonderful experience for you. Thanks so much. Hope everything's going well for you. Bye.